give us an insight into the processes of this culture, as well as the value system that it promoted and inculcated. So whatever you have understood about this culture and its value system from the stories of Nizamuddin Aulia, I would like to sort of concretize and put that down today. So instead of slides, we'll do notes today that as we sometimes do. Okay, let us open the participants list, and floor is open for you guys. Go ahead, raise your hands or write in the chat. Fatima. Yeah, a little low, beta.
Can you hear me now?
Much better. Huh. Go ahead.
Okay, so there's a small tiny detail which was mentioned in the reading, and I found it like really fascinating. Was that the Sufi orders did not try to develop a universal order. Like there were like many orders, for example, Qadriya and Chishtiya Silsila, which were particularly mentioned in the reading. So yeah, I really like this that they did not try to universalize one order and did not labeled one order as superior to another. Like they all respected each other, and yeah. And another thing which I wanted to go through was like the spiritual what would I say, like the spiritual I cannot have a word like Sufi sheikhs, they train their trainees for about like 3 years. So I think that it's also fascinating that you cannot achieve the spiritual power in like just one day or after just one meditation. Like it takes time, and like there are 3 years you have to go through, and then the Sufi sheikh would authorize you to practice this. So yes.
Fatma, I missed a little bit of what you said towards the end. आवाज धीमी हो रही थी आपकी. Just last few thoughts again, please.
Yeah, okay, so my last thought was on the Sufi sheikhs having a probation period of 3 years. Like, I like how you cannot, it's just like a degree or something. And you have to go through a process, a proper education to become a Sufi. Like, not everyone can be called a Sufi or a spiritual leader. Like, you have to go through a proper process.
Okay, what about that?
Yeah, so like there were 3 years, the three trainee years.
Yeah.
Like the first year it was devoted to serving people. Second year it was devoted to the service of God. Sorry. And the third year was about guarding your heart. And then the Sufi sheikh would like bestow a certificate type of thing that like you are now qualified person, like you can like go on the path of tariqa now.
So what's your question?
Oh no, that's what my comment.
Okay.
I really like this thing. Yes.
The concept of service. Okay. Thank you,
Yes.
Fatma.
You're welcome. Thank you so much.
Okay. Muhammad Ali, what would you like to talk about? You are saying that you want to talk about the 6 stages of Sufi enlightenment?
Yes, so I read about एक तो it's मैंने वो जो रिजवी वाली रीडिंग है वो मैंने 3 दिन पहले की थी बिफोर लास्ट क्लास आई थिंक. सो उसमें मैंने पढ़ी थी ना ये जो दो बेसिकली तीन आई थिंक उसको हम डिवाइड कर सकते हैं रीडिंग को पार्ट्स में जो आपने पेजेस के थ्रू की थी. तो पहले इट टॉक्स अबाउट मिस्टिसिज्म और सूफिज्म इज एंड देन इट टॉक्स अबाउट the you know the logistics of Sufi orders. So how it happens is कि first like एक बंदा आता है ना जिस कोई भी अचीव कर सकता है ना सूफीज्म थ्रू प्रॉपर प्रैक्टिस. तो there are basically 6 stages or there's like I think a 7th stage that's a final stage like जो कि I think आखिर में होती है like when जब उसके बाद उर्स होता है जिस दिन उर्स मनाया जाता है किसी सूफी का when they finally leave this material world and achieve that closeness to God because Sufism का basically मकसद ये है to love God in to क्योंकि जो उनका महबूब होता है वो उनका खुदा होता है. तो वो उसके फाइनली करीब पहुंच जाते हैं इसलिए वो उर्स जो होता है उसको एक वेडिंग कस्टम भी कहा जाता है. और मैं एक और बात ये कहना चाहूंगा कि सूफीज्म के अंदर एक ही चीज है कि जो एक पीर और मुरीद का आपस में एक रिलेशनशिप है ना वो ऐसा होता है कि एक पीर जो होता है वो बहुत करीब होता है खुदा के और वो खुदा को मतलब वो खुदा से मोहब्बत कर रहे होते हैं और उन्होंने ये सारे जो स्टेजेस होते हैं वो पार करके वो बहुत इनलाइटेंड होते हैं. तो जो उनके मुरीद होते हैं वो उन पीर के खुद पीर जो पीर है वो खुदा से मोहब्बत कर रहे हैं और जो मुरीद है वो पीर से मोहब्बत करके पीर को वसीला बना के वो भी खुदा से मोहब्बत कर रहे हैं. तो वो पीर को एज एन एक वसीला के तौर पर इस्तेमाल करते हैं. वो इसी वजह से अपने जो पीर होता है उनकी वो इतनी रिस्पेक्ट करते हैं इतनी मोहब्बत करते हैं और उन्हीं के बारे में इस तरह की शायरी करते हैं जिस तरह ख्वाजा नाज़िमुद्दीन औलिया के बारे में वो अमीर खुसरो करते थे और बुल्ले शाह जो थे शाह इनायत के बारे में करते थे. तो उन्होंने उनसे बेसिकली मोहब्बत होती थी कि उनमें उनको रब दिखता था. तो एक चीज मुझे जो सिमिलर लगी वो ये थी इसमें विद हिंदुइज्म वो के हमारे लिए हमारे पढ़ाया जाता है ना लाइक अपनी मैं अगर बात करूं मेरी अपब्रिंगिंग थोड़ी सी सुन्नी उसमें हुई है कि जिसमें हमें ये सिखाया जाता है कि मतलब शिर्क बहुत बुरी चीज है ना तो शिर्क से हमेशा बच के रहना है. तो उसमें ये कहा जाता है कि हिंदू बुत परस्ती की तरफ होते हैं तो वो शिर्क करते हैं. लेकिन अगर देखा जाए तो वो फॉर एग्जांपल वंस लव फॉर कृष्णा और वंस लव फॉर राम इज देयर लव फॉर ईश्वर. तो वो उसके थ्रू एक्सप्रेस करते हैं और जो सूफी होते हैं वो भी और हमें मुझे सूफीज्म और उसके साथ तसव्वुफ से थोड़ा सा हमें परहेज करने को कहा गया है अपब्रिंगिंग के थ्रू. तो वो इसके साथ सिमिलर है इस वजह से मतलब ऐसे अपब्रिंगिंग मेरी थोड़ी सी कह लें अब वहां भी उसमें हुई हुई है. तो वो अब चीजें मुझे समझ में आती है. मैं जो शुरू में पढ़ रहा था ये सारी बातें तो मैं इवन के डॉक्यूमेंट्री जो मैंने देखी थी वो सेवन शरीफ के बारे में तो वो जो अब वो उधर हरकतें कर रहे थे तो अपेरेंटली दे सीम वेरी सेक्रिलिजियस कि यार ये तो इस्लाम नहीं है और ये सारी बातें ये तो कुफर है कि अगर आप किसी को बोलो कि मुझे उसमें खुदा दिखता है. तो वो लेकिन वो चीज आप मुझे इस तरह समझ में आ गई.
Very nicely put. Thank you, Ali. Huzaifa.
अच्छा तो शेख निज़ामुद्दीन का जो तमाम अहवाल हैं जो शुरू की जो उनकी लाइफ है अगर उसको देखा जाए तो वो काफ़ी मतलब गुर्बत में गुजरी है उनकी और फिर जिस तरह होता है कि मतलब उनको खाने के लिए कुछ नहीं मिलता था और इस तरह की जो चीज़ें हैं तो इसको अगर देखा जाए तो जो चीज़ है जैसे जो जब वो बाबा फरीद के पास जाते हैं लेकिन फिर वहाँ पर भी उनको खाने को नहीं दिया जाता. ठीक है तो इससे एक बात ये पता लगती है कि ये जो चीज़ है ये जो रास्ता है ये काफ़ी मुश्किल है ये आसानी से हाथ में नहीं आता. ठीक है तो मेरे ख़्याल में जो उनकी जो शुरू की उनकी ज़िंदगी और बाद में भी जो उनका वो है तो उससे यही सबक मिलता है कि जो सूफियों का रास्ता है उसमें इस तरह की जो मतलब जैसे रियाजत है यहाँ ये एक उसका एक ख़ास पहलू है.
बिल्कुल. और कुछ हुज़ैफा? नहीं. हाँ ओके. Faziresh?
Hello, miss. Can you hear me?
Yes, better.
The story of Khwaja Nizamuddin describes how Sufism is more than just a religious experience. It is a lifestyle, and it requires a lot of training. So the first part of the story is based on how under the influence of Baba Farid, he was able to, get the title of a sheikh. And so his story was really inspiring in the sense that he was encouraged to continue his studies regardless of his circumstances. And as Huzaifa pointed out कि बहुत गुर्बत में उन्होंने जिंदगी गुजारी थी. um, the entire reading talks about how simple Khwaja Nizamuddin was, and how he lived a really simple life. And I think that was also very inspiring. Uh, One thing that I really liked about the entire story was that the Sheikh said that altruism is more rewarding, and it's more important than just, offering obligatory prayers. I think that was a very nice way to explain the true essence of Islam. So I really liked that.
Okay, thank you. Mariam.
Hello, can you hear me?
थोड़ी सी आवाज कट रही
Am I
है.
on?
नहीं आ रही.
Am I audible now?
Now, yes, go ahead.
All right. So what Huzaifa talked about, how the path is difficult and challenging throughout. It's also important to note that the path, the tariqa, could not be, traversed without the sheikh or the guidance of peer. And the reading mentioned around 3 reasons for that. So one of the main reasons was that how the path involved a journey to many spiritual stations, such as Tawbah or in-up or tawakkul. So it's reached through constant contemplation, supervision, which cannot be done without a sheikh or, a peer. And one other was that how only a peer, a perfect peer, is able to distinguish between, the true illumination or a false one, which could be, uh, by the devil or the shaitan. So that's also important to have guidance for the murid. And how what also Ali thought, there is a special connection between a peer and a murid. So the personal experience teaching that spirituality could only be described to the peer, nobody else, because of the bond that exists between the sheikh and the murid.
Say that last part again, beta.
The third reason that reading mentioned was how that personal spiritual experience that the murid would experience, and through the path could only be revealed to the peer, because only the peer would understand and interpret it correctly, and nobody else. So that connects to the point that Ali mentioned, with a special bond between a peer and a murid.
Yes, yes, very true. Hamna.
Okay, so I just wanted to highlight 2 of the things which Sheikh Nizamuddin Aulia really stressed upon. So firstly, he said that you should not like something for others, what you do not like for yourself. This means कि आप जो है अपने लिए बेहतर ना चाहें और दूसरे के लिए बुरा ना चाहें. So this was the first lesson that he stressed upon. And the second one, which was something new for me, was that he said that the first thing that a person must do is to detach himself from the material world, and then he should focus on prayers and fasting. So this was something new for me, because I didn't know that he believed कि सबसे पहले आपको material world से detach होने की ज़रूरत है, because the idea behind this was that कि जब तक you do not detach yourself from the real world, then the essence behind the motive behind prayers and fasting आपका वही पूरा नहीं हो पाएगा. So yeah.
Okay, so but tell me a little more. What did you understand about this? What does this detachment mean?
So this detachment basically means कि जो है from the material world. For example, there was this, I do not exactly remember, but there was this incident where somebody came up to him regarding his economic loss, the story of his economic loss. So he So he explained to him how somebody else also had gone through the same incident, but he did not give up, or jitna bhi unke paas tha, he made sure that he lived his life beautifully jitna bhi tha. So the economic gains ya economic aapka jo bhi hai, it does not define who you are. The main thing which you should focus on in your life is to detach yourself from the world. Matlab worldly things pe you do not spend more time, but to connect yourself with Allah, because when you matlab when you submit to him, so आपके paths खुद ही खुलते रहते हैं, and he helps you with everything. So I think this means not to be reduced to worldly things only.
Would anybody else? Well, I'll go down the list. Give me 1 second though. I want to remind you of something. So, guys, remember this concept and this set of verses by Maulana Rumi. Do you now make the connection between the constant emphasis on detaching from worldly things and this concept of La Ilah? Okay, that was Hamna Ali.
You want me to talk about this? मैं अब एक दूसरे points.
You could, or if there's something else you wanted to say, go for it.
तो मैं एक और ख्वाजा नाज़िमुद्दीन की लाइफ के बारे में ये रीडिंग से पता चला था कि उनको भी ऑपोजिशन फेस करनी पड़ी थी दिल्ली के अंदर बिकॉज ऑफ दी एक जो हो जाते हैं एक उलेमा बन जाते हैं और एक जो सूफी होते हैं सूफी आजाद जो एक एस्थेटिक लाइफ जी रहे होते हैं तो वही जो एक डिस्टिंक्शन है कि मतलब वो जो उलेमा थे वो अभी भी मैं अपनी जो पर्सनल लाइफ है उस पर भी यही मेरे साथ होता है कि हमें उस पर फोकस कराया जाता है एंड हमें तो ये एडवाइस किया जाता है कि आपने उससे दूर रहना है दूसरी साइड से बिकॉज दैट कैन लीड यू टू शिर्क और जो हजरत ख्वाजा नाज़िमुद्दीन थे उनको दिल्ली में एक मतलब वो रीडिंग के अंदर वो वाकया था बयान किया वो जब वो सुल्तान के उसमें उनको समन किया गया था और फिर वहां पे वो एक हदीस पढ़ने लगे थे लेकिन उनको रोक दिया था उन्होंने क्योंकि उन्होंने कहा था कि आप मुजतहिद नहीं है आप इस वजह से उनको रोक दिया गया था तो उनको फिर इस तरह की चीज फेस करनी पड़ी थी दिल्ली के अंदर ऑपोजिशन में
Yeah, that's a good point. We'll talk more about this relationship of the ruling elite, the Sultan and his ministers and generals, and this religious elite. Umair?
Am I audible?
Yes.
I actually had a question about the section on page 99. So when they start talking about the khanqahs, that they insisted that the Sufi should go to town begging. So the first reason for this are it would intend humility, right? Yeah. And the second part, I understand, it says that to strengthen the feeling among Sufis that they were the lowliest of all God's creatures. So what does this part mean?
The loneliest of all God's creatures. What do you think?
Lowliest.
Lowliest. What do you think it means? There it is.
I mean, I related this to the part about Nizamuddin Aulia's section about where he says that he lives a very miserable and unhappy life because he cannot handle all the grief that the Muslim Ummah faces. So I linked it to that, but I don't know what else this could mean.
I'm going to leave this question open, huh? Everybody who still has their hands up can take a stab at it. There is a story that kind of addresses it. I'm just trying to find it and remind me. I will read it. But till then, Sana. Sana?
Yeah, am I audible?
Yes, beta.
Yeah. So I had a few observations and I also had a question, but my question is kind of unclear, so I'm going to get to that in the end.
Okay.
So one thing that I wanted to talk about was the kind of individual fluidity that Sufism has, even though previously someone mentioned that it is like a degree and that you need 3 years to practice. I also read that for some people that process might be easier. For some people, they might be able to practice sooner. And for some people, I think it's really interesting how it keeps into mind the bond that you have with your sheikh or your peer, and find your individual capability as a person, right? So then I wanted to compare that with modern Islam.
Okay.
And how we look at Sufism as millennials, and how our generation and the ones older than us tell us about Sufism. We've always, like Ali previously mentioned, we've always been told that it's something closer to shirk. I, in my brought up, have also been told that it's a path that does not take as much strength. And I never saw it as something that was as difficult. And I always looked at religious ulamas.
Just to, since you're reiterating something Ali already brought up, this is actually the common modern understanding.
The common belief,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah.
Okay, carry on.
And then I also wanted to talk about how it's really ironic that before I studied about Sufism, I always thought that religious ulama and Maulvis were much closer to Sunnah than Sufis are. And then when I see the importance of poverty in Holy Prophet's life, and then I see the importance of poverty in a Sufi's life, that parallel just kind of proves this common belief wrong. And it proves how Sufism is seen as this mystic babas who don't do much and they're just sitting there. And this is just something that we have all been taught, we've all been socialized into since we were children. So I think that was really interesting. And then I had this question, but I was just opening up the reading, which is why it took me time to turn on my mic. It was about the master of Nizamuddin Aulia. I think I'm forgetting his name, but there was this instance that they described about how he was teaching the Quran, or he was translating the Quran to his students, and his students said that his brother has a better copy, or his brother has a better version of it. Baba Farid, yes, thank you, Umair. So I asked about the significance of that certain incident because I didn't quite understand the meaning behind it.
It's a copy of an important book, the Awariful Ma'arif.
Yeah, and they said that his brother, Baba Farid's brother, has a better copy, and then Baba Farid got really angry, and yeah, so I didn't really understand the whole incident and why it was mentioned.
Okay, let's read it. It is on page 158. I'm going to read it out to you, but you guys can look at it. The severity of Baba Farid's tutelage is also clearly depicted in the following story. The Baba was teaching his disciples from a defective copy of the Awariful Ma'arif, and at the same time taking great care to correct the errors. His pupil remarked that the Baba's brother, Sheikh Najibuddin, had a more perfect copy of the work. अच्छा क्यों ये उस जमाने में बहुत होता था क्योंकि हर चीज हाथ से कॉपी की जाती थी ना. These are all hand copied manuscripts, so some were better than others. The Sheikh was amazed when he discovered this, as his statement had been intended merely as Sheikh Najmuddin had a more perfect copy. Baba Farid reacted vehemently against such a suggestion, which appeared to him to imply an inability on his part to correct the copy. The Sheikh was amazed when he discovered this, as his statement had been intended merely as a factual one. This is Nizamuddin. Falling at his master's feet, he apologized profusely. The Baba was unsatisfied, however, and in despair, his disciple contemplated taking his own life. Finally, due to the supplication of one of his sons, the Baba relented, telling Nizamuddin that he had done it for his own purification, as the Peer is the mashhata of the murid. Okay, now, what do you think is happening here? Does anybody
Okay,
remember
so
me telling you about how the importance of live teaching, right? How even in the disciplines associated with rational ilm, such as legal scholarship or hadith scholarship or legal tafsir, you still, the convention in the pre-modern Islamic world was that you had to go physically study with a living teacher who was an expert in a particular, not a subject, in a particular book, right? There was a canon, by the way, a developing canon of certain books that were considered essential to becoming more and more expert in a particular subject. And you couldn't just study those books on your own by reading them. It was essential, considered essential, to study them under the guidance of a living master. One of the reasons was this very practical reason that the written copy, because it was, in a manuscript culture, isn't necessarily trustworthy. But that's the more superficial reason. The deeper reason is that in this culture, the value placed on the written word was kind of low compared to the value we place on the written word today, because it was understood that the deeper meanings behind the language are not immediately apparent through the language. You need somebody who has spent time genuinely chewing on it, reflecting on it, learning from other masters to truly explain to you कि सूरत के अंदर मायने क्या हैं. तो ये सूरत और मायने वाला value system was common across different traditions in Islam. And the legal scholar believed it just as much as the Sufi believed it. So that is what you're seeing at play in this story. Because it doesn't matter if the written copy is defective. What matters is that the teacher teaching it, in this case Baba Farid, is not defective. Because his teaching and his presence and his knowledge of the book is far more important than the actual manuscript, which was treated as a set of notes.
Okay, thank you.
Miss, can you repeat that? It's a bit difficult.
Sorry, Sarang ji?
Can you repeat that? I got a bit lost in the middle.
I'm not going to repeat it, but maybe somebody else will, and you can listen to this later, but we'll come back to it. I was just talking about the general importance of having a living teacher. It wasn't limited to Sufi circles. Okay, Iman?
All right, so I want to talk about two themes that really stood out for me. And so one of them was how there was one incident about Nizamuddin Auliya, in which they basically told us that he used to fast really frequently. And as he used to break his fast, and while he used to, start his fast, so his meals used to be very little. And people used to ask him that, why don't you have some more food? So he replied that he started to cry, and he said that, how can I have more food when there's so many people in our community who, sleep hungry in mosques and on the roads. So that was something that he didn't find as fitting. And that, I think, makes us understand that the Sufis were not really oblivious of what was happening in their surroundings. They had that concern and that sympathy for people. And that's something that we don't really, often think that Sufis have that characteristic, because we think that they're very self-absorbed, and just, the only thing they care about is their own worship and their own, spiritual awakening. And the other thing that I want to talk about is how, throughout this text also, and this was something that I linked with the Lombard reading as well, how they showed that the Sufis, they used to have, they didn't, deny the importance of seeking knowledge. And even Nizamuddin Auliya, it's written in the text that he gained knowledge about Hadith and about Quran, and he memorized the Quran as well. So I think that is important, because even as the Lombard reading pointed out, that for the early Sufis, none of what they said or what they did was actually in conflict with the Quran and Sunnah. And that was the primary means of, the knowledge. And then in addition to that was there, part of the Sufi tradition was focusing on your inner self and cultivating those characteristics that would lead you to do the good that is prescribed to us. So I think if we have that perspective, that sort of shapes our perspective of the modern Sufism as well. Because in my personal opinion, it's a fact that traditions and even religions, they do change over time. And as the people start forgetting some of the main fundamental concepts of that traditional religion, they do maybe start incorporating practices that might not, have been done by the original founders of that particular religion or tradition. So I think if we know that, then it sort of stops us from putting modern Sufism into boxes of, okay, this is shirk and this is not shirk and this is fine and that is not fine. Because obviously they can be changes, but as long as we know what the original Sufi tradition actually, stood up for, that's something that's important for us. And also it's important to focus on the similarities rather than the differences. That's about it.
Thank you, Iman. So yes, this is true. And I might word it slightly differently, because I have been constantly and will constantly keep cautioning you against thinking in terms of original and authentic versus later and adulterated. This is also a very modern value system that we place on things, especially religious traditions, कि जो ओरिजिनल है वो ऑथेंटिक है, और जो बाद में उससे हट के चीज़ आती है वो किसी तरह से अडल्टरेट हो जाती है. So that's not quite true. It's also not how Muslims thought of the evolving traditions within Islam. What I will bring you back to, and which you have also touched on, is what we are trying to learn here as students of history. And that is to educate ourselves on the context in which certain texts, certain rituals and practices, certain beliefs, the context in which they emerged, so that we can, just as, the Sheikh and the Alim would tell you, so that we can dive beneath the surface of the surat or the outer form and understand the maine, or the deeper form, and its roots and reasons and rationales, which is what we're doing here. Your exposure, or most of us, right, generally, unless we are lucky enough to have a particular background, most of us in the modern era have a certain exposure to a particular stereotype of the Sufi or Tasawwuf. And it's a very surface or surat oriented stereotype, right? Where you are never invited to, or, taught to go beneath the surface or the outer appearance or the surat and think about the maine and what all of it means. All right, Anas.
Am I audible?
Yes.
I also wanted to bring up two things. So one thing that really stood out to me from the reading, as I read about Nizamuddin Aulia's story and how he eventually got Khilafat Nama from Baba Farid was how many, the extent to which one can purify their nafs. Because the way I understood it in my upbringing, I only knew about the nafs al-mutma'inna, and then only through the reading did I realize that there would be nafs al-marziya, which denounced everything but God, and even further than that, a nafs al-kamila, which was basically like the completely faultless soul. That was something that was really interesting to me. And the other thing was that something that we discussed in this class as well was the concept of death, in the sense that you are reconnecting with the spiritual force that you had been disconnected from at birth. And that is something that I reflected on and found to be, again, very interesting. So these were the two things that stuck out from the story and the reading.
Okay, thank you. I'm would actually like to show you something, Anas. Also there in your slide deck, but this gives me an opportunity to take you through important things that maybe I didn't at the time. Could we not have? Okay, one sec. No. Aha. Okay. So this ties into a very fundamental difference between the Western Christian understanding of the fundamental nature of the human being and the Quranic Islamic understanding of the nature of the human being. And as modern Muslims, most of us are sort of stuck somewhere in between. We are all influenced by the Western European Christian idea that there is something fundamentally suspicious and base about the human animal nature, and that there is a binary in human nature where there's a lower nature and a higher nature, and we tend to use that binary concept even when we're trying to understand the concept of nafs and fana in tasawwuf. It isn't really a binary because the starting point is very different. And the starting point is this belief that comes straight out of the Quranic text about the place of the human being in all of God's creation, right? You all know this term, Ashraful Makhluqat. And for the Sufis, it was particularly important and something they really reflected on, you know, and for them, it placed a certain responsibility on the human being to be the best that he or she can be. And so this idea of the nafs kamila and the insan kamil come out of Sufi philosophy because of the Quranic declaration about human beings being ashraful makhluqat. And the whole love discourse of tasawwuf is also rooted in this, that the reason the human being has this stature, you know, insan ka ye darja isliye hai because he is the most loved of God's creations and was in fact created to love God back. And so human nature is designed, it's hardwired to know, understand, and be able to love the one God. Even the angels don't have this capacity to love in the way that the human being has been created with this capacity. So the more you reflect on this, the more all the things that we are learning about Sufi values and philosophy will make sense. Because if you have been created with a unique capacity for love, then of course you should be demonstrating that love for your fellow human beings, for innocent animals, for this earth and nature as part of God's creation. All these things are precious, and you were created to love them, because through them you will learn to love God. May I'll come back to you, Kanwal.
I wanted to share my understanding of Omar's question about what it means. The people, the Sufis, they were the lowliest of God's creations, and why that is connected to poverty or begging. So I think it means that through begging, they had this idea solidified or strengthened, that they were dependent on others, and within themselves they had no real power through which they could, I guess, earn a living or have something to eat or anything that sustains life. So they didn't have any power within themselves. They always had to be dependent on God and on God's connections or on God's wasila. So that was my understanding. And also I had a question as well. The question was about how, I don't exactly remember, but someone stated the story here about Baba Farid and Nizamuddin Aulia. So Baba Farid became like really angry when Nizamuddin Aulia stated that his brother had a correct copy of the Quran, right?
Not the Quran. Were you listening? I actually read the Quran.
I'm sorry, yeah, not the Quran. I did read it. I apologize. It was a book. I don't remember.
Yeah, it doesn't matter.
But yeah, okay. So he got angry at that. And I connected that to another story I read a while ago about Maulana Rumi and how he used to teach children. And he said that if a father brings his child to me and I ask him, why did you bring him to me? And he says something like, I brought him so he can learn. And then he would say something like, if he comes to you with a cracked head or broken foot, will you say to him, why did he beat you? So he would ask the father that, I am going to beat this child. Will you question it? And if the father would say yes, so he would send them away. So basically he had this idea that, all right, he would beat the child to make him learn. And I couldn't place this within the culture, like the idea of love that the Tasawwuf has. And I couldn't connect anger and love basically.
All right. So again, our difficulty to perhaps find the connection between anger or disciplinary action and love is also just a reflection of who we are and the value system of the world we live in. For them, certainly the relationship between a sheikh and his murid was one of tough love. It was the sheikh's job to be tough in order to train the soul of the young murid. And being tough is actually quite difficult, is how they would have viewed it, and is how they did view it. Also, it was absolutely necessary if you were going to succeed on the path of tariqah, you needed to begin with a genuine and serious commitment to turning your life over to your chosen sheikh, because that ultimate act of surrendering your will was part of the training. You can't walk the path without also learning how do you detach from worldly concerns. You can do the outer things, live like a faqir, not eat food, not keep money, so on and so forth. But ultimately, what are we most attached to? A sense of self and our desire to exert agency or our will. And that is the final training and test, is to be able to fully surrender your will to the sheikh. Because what is that? That again is practice and a dress rehearsal for ultimate submission, salama or Islam, to God. So that is a baseline demand of a Sufi sheikh from any new murid and his family. You have to give yourself up to it completely. You have to commit completely, because it is a hard path. Ramin.
Yeah, so I wanted to talk about the whole lowliest creature concept, and Kaval basically said what I wanted to say, but I want to add how it's quite ironic how this concept also has to do with how humans themselves are the highest creatures that God created. Like, because when you like when you make yourself live on that lowest rung of the ladder of like complete poverty and of extreme simplicity, and you're completely submitting yourself to the will of God, it's also in a way kind of making yourself useful to the purpose of being alive as God's highest creatures, because now you're kind of living for the sole purpose of loving. So I think that's very true. And I also wanted to talk about that part in the reading that mentioned how different silsilas and how the recruitment of different students that the sheikh did wasn't kind of like linear and wasn't standardized. So if one silsila kind of took in people based on like their individual capacities and talents, like some sheikhs scrutinized every single potential candidate based on their capacities, and then others just took in students indiscriminately. I also really found that interesting because it shows that despite like variations in the way tariqa is practiced, it's the one common unifying factor among all of them is love. So even though their methodologies may be different, I like how they all center around the same sort of concept.
Yeah, there is definitely a core philosophy, and then quite a bit of divergence on specific beliefs and practices. I will reiterate here, again, in response to both the previous comments, that this discourse of love, right, within Tasawwuf and Islam in general, the discourse of ishq and muhabbat is talking about an emotion that is not in the least bit gentle. It is a very, very, no, it is the most powerful force that the human being is capable of feeling and generating, right? So it is almost a word for life itself, for God as the life force. Ishq and Muhabbat and Hub, they encompass all of these concepts together. Ishq is a very, very powerful, destructive force even. And it is a very scary thing to surrender yourself to it. But that is the path. And that's what you have to do when you're on the path. All right, Umair and then Ali.
Yeah, so I'm just trying to understand the fakir concept. So I don't think it was very binary that either you're a fakir or you're not. I mean, because they still engaged with merchants and they had trade routes across South Asia. So I don't think it was like complete, like just ridding yourself of all material. It was just something that they had to do along with existing in the current world. Also, I was thinking about Hazrat Khizr and his incident with Moses, with Hazrat Musa. And the last line of that, I don't quite understand that. It says he finally leaves Musa and on departing gives him the explanation of his actions, which had their good reasons. And then the importance that Hazrat Khizr had in the life of Sufis. So I just want to talk about that as well.
All right. And we will. Ali? Muhammad Ali, your hand is still up, beta.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't hear you पहले. तो I have a question. रीडिंग के अंदर मतलब अभी मैंने पहले बात की थी अबाउट के शेख निजामुद्दीन को वो अपोजिशन मिली थी उलमा के तरफ से, तो उसमें एक उन्होंने एक सीन डिस्क्राइब किया रीडिंग के अंदर जिसमें वो उलमा जो होते हैं वो जो एक होता है समा, उसका क्वेश्चन दोबारा ले आते हैं शेख निजामुद्दीन को अटैक करने के लिए. तो मेरा सवाल ये है कि ये समा क्या होता है, मतलब व्हाट वाज इट अबाउट, कि वो क्या चीज है जिसके बारे में वो बात कर रहे हैं. आई कुडंट अंडरस्टैंड दैट. उन्होंने भी ये भी कहा था कि कैन यू हियर मी?
Yes. Can you find the page?
The page is I think एक second.
ढूंढ लो.
It's 161.
ठीक है.
161 last paragraph.
सही है. Yes. The ulama and some Sufis were envious of Sheikh Nizamuddin's personal popularity among the elite and the masses, and attempted to further estrange relations between him and the Sultan. They reopened the age-old question of sama as a weapon by which to attack him. And they alleged that the Sheikh's only concern in life was indulgence in the legally prohibited sama, and that he and his disciples were totally engrossed in merrymaking. At the suggestion of the anti-Sheikh faction, the Sultan organized a mehzar. Over 250 scholars were lined up to oppose the Sheikh who attended with his disciples, including Maulana Fakhruddin. Maulana Fakhruddin, having written a book on the subject, believed he was well prepared to answer the objections of the orthodox. Qazi Ruknuddin, an inveterate enemy of the Sheikh and somebody who enjoyed dominating any situation, led the discussion. Sheikh Nizamuddin quoted a hadith from the Prophet, but the Qazi objected to his argument on the grounds that the Sheikh was not a mujtahid and therefore not entitled to quote hadith as an authority. Instead, he should support his argument from the statement of Imam Abu Hanifa, the founder of the Hanafite Mazhab. Maulana Alamuddin, a grandson of Sheikh Bahauddin Zakaria, assumed the role of arbitrator. This is another order, okay? He had also written a book on the subject of Sama and had traveled to Makkah, Medina, Egypt, and Syria. Everywhere he had been, he argued, Sufis indulged in Sama. There was no objection in those areas to its use, as the Sheikh and his companions were holy men endowed with ethical and ascetic qualities of a high caliber, argued Maulana Alamuddin. No objection could be raised against their indulgence in Sama. Sultan Ghayasuddin Tughlaq refused to give a judgment, and the Sheikh and his followers were allowed to depart honorably. This is in fact, let's read on, okay? This whole extended set of episodes is really interesting and really important. On his return to his Jamaat Khana, Sheikh Nizamuddin expressed regret. Guys, I'm reading basically, this is end of page 161 and all of page 162. On his return to his Jamaat Khana, Nizamuddin expressed regret at the disregard of the Qazi and the ulama for the Prophet's tradition, and he prophesied that some calamity was likely to befall the capital city of Delhi, where all these ulama live. It would seem that the Sultan was satisfied with the argument of the Sufis and later dismissed Qazi Ruknuddin. A number of later works, such as the Tabaqat-e-Akbari, however, assert that the Sultan continued to bear enmity towards Sheikh Nizamuddin and ordered him to leave Delhi before he returned from an expedition to Bengal. And the Sheikh is reported to have remarked, this is a very famous line actually, दिल्ली दूर अस्त, दिल्ली दूर है, यानी कि बंगाल जा रहे थे सुल्तान और कहा कि मेरे आने से पहले तुम दिल्ली से निकल जाना, लेकिन जहाँ सुल्तान गए थे वहाँ से दिल्ली दूर था. All he said was दिल्ली दूर अस्त. This myth became popular mainly because Sultan Ghiyasuddin Tughlaq's sudden death on his, before he came back. So it's as though Nizamuddin predicted it. Now, although not just predicted it, but that God protected him. Although there is no indication that the misunderstanding between the Sultan and the Sheikh abated, the Sultan was indeed too shrewd a politician. Listen here carefully, okay? The Sultan was a shrewd politician. So he did not adopt extreme measures against the Sheikh. They both died in 1325, first the Sultan and later Sheikh Nizamuddin. अच्छा जी, तो क्या हो रहा है इस पूरी कहानी में? Huzaifa and Amna, your hands are up. Do you have anything to say that relates to this story of the relationship between the Tughlaq Sultan and Sheikh Nizamuddin? Yes, Amna?
My comment was about the Sufis being the lowly creatures, but since you've started this, you can continue this and I'll just wait till the end.
हुज़ैफ़ा, आप इस बारे में कुछ कह रहे थे या कुछ और कह रहे हैं?
अच्छा, तो मैं कुछ और कहना था, लेकिन ये इसके बारे में मैं जो मेरी समझ है इस तरह है कि पहले ज़माने में इस तरह होता था कि लोग किसी ख़ास शख्सियत की गिरद जमा होते थे, तो फिर जो सुल्तान होता था या जिसके पास हुकूमत होती थी उसको ख़तरा शुरू हो जाता था कि शायद मेरे ख़िलाफ़ कहीं बगावत ना हो रही हो, या क्योंकि इस तरह बहुत वाक़यात हो चुके थे, तो शायद इस वजह से क्योंकि उनकी जो इतनी शोहरत थी, तो एक तो ये है कि हसद हुआ होगा सुल्तान को, और दूसरा ये हो सकता है कि शायद उसको ये ख़तरा पैदा हो कि इस तरह का कुछ हो सकता है, ठीक है। तो इस वजह से ये रोड़े अटकाना और ये सारा कुछ करना। और दूसरा ये कि उलमा का जो ये एक मतलब जैसे मुनाजरा हुआ है और ये सारी जो चीज़ें, ये नज़र आता है कि सूफ़ियों के ख़िलाफ़ ऐसा मतलब चलता आया है काफ़ी मतलब उससे, क्योंकि वो समझते हैं कि भाई ये बिदअत करते हैं, और मतलब जिस तरह के एक काफ़ी वो एक ये भी है कि भाई जिस तरह ये ज़िक्र करते हैं जमात के साथ, ये भी एक बिदअत है, क्योंकि इस तरह का कुछ भी हुज़ूर सल्लल्लाहु अलैहि वसल्लम के दौर में नहीं हुआ, ठीक है। तो इसको भी बुनियाद बनाया जाता है, और ख़ास तौर पर जो समा है, म्यूज़िक जो है, इसके ऊपर बहुत ज़्यादा करते हैं, क्योंकि हुज़ूर सल्लल्लाहु अलैहि वसल्लम ने अपनी हदीस में कहा हुआ है कि भाई मौसीकी हराम है, तो वो कहते हैं कि अगर वो चीज़ हराम है तो किस तरह से आप कर सकते हैं, ठीक है। तो ये जो सारी चीज़ें ये होती हैं, अब देखें उलमा, एक काजी बिलफर्ज आप तसव्वुर करें तो वो एक जज है और उसकी भी अपनी एक मतलब मशहूरी है, ठीक है। और मतलब वो चाहता है कि मेरी तरफ लोग देखें, लेकिन चूँकि आम लोगों के जो उनके पास जो इज़्ज़त है सूफ़ी शेख के लिए, वो एक काजी के लिए नहीं हो सकती, ठीक है। तो जो ज़ायद का जो कॉन्सेप्ट है और जो वाइज़ का जो आपने समझाया था, ठीक है, जो मतलब इनकी शायरी में बार-बार आता है, जो ये तंज़ किया जाता है, वो ऐसे उलमा की को आड़ बनाकर किया जाता है, जो कि इस तरह के मतलब हसद में आकर और फतावा देते हैं और इस तरह की हरकत।
Thank you, Huzaifa. There's a bunch of things going on in this whole section. So one of the really important things that has not been explicitly stated in this retelling of the story is that जो कोर्ट एसोसिएटेड उलमा थे, कोर्ट एसोसिएटेड उलमा होते कौन थे? बेसिकली ये ब्यूरोक्रेट्स होते थे, ठीक है ना। जो काजी का ओहदा था that is a bureaucratic office. So it's much better to think of them in those terms. British colonial rule ended that system, right? Which is why the ulama had to reinvent roles for themselves. But in all of, you know, the long pre-colonial history of Islam, the developing role of the alim of all stripes was as an officer of the state, not necessarily a qazi. The legal scholars would go into, you know, that stream of the civil service, but many of them served in other parts of government administration. So they are very sarkari in their mentality. That we can relate to, right? And hence, just a few, and maybe only one who is mentioned by name here, right? Where is he? Ruknuddin was somebody who was particularly like this, with a, you know, legalistic Sarkari mentality, and therefore had a real problem with Nizamuddin. Now, the question that we need to be asking, and that, you know, begs to be asked, is Padi kya thi sabko? Why should they single out Sheikh Nizamuddin for all of this? You know, what was it about this figure that was so important that it needed to be, that he needed to be challenged, right? So just the fact that all these challenges came means that the Sheikh wielded enormous social influence. And it was influence based entirely on his charisma and his person, and not on power, which is what the influence of the state and the servants of the state is based on, right? They have a monopoly on the exercise of power through violence. So that is really the source of the envy and the suspicion. The Sufi Sheikh, particularly someone like Nizamuddin, was a popular figure. And the structure of a Sultanate government was such that popular figures were terrifying to them, because these were totalitarian military states. But there is more. There is also a growing culture. Remember, we talked about how the importance of the figure of the Sufi Sheikh rose exponentially after the Mongol invasions and the destruction of the caliphate. And there was this vacuum in the religious and spiritual leadership of the Muslim world that needed to be filled, because there was no longer even a figurehead caliph. So it is not the ulama who rose to fill this position, this very high, elevated position. It was the Sufi sheikhs, aista, aista. And so the sultans of the Muslim world, whether it's the Tughlaqs in Delhi or, you know, the Seljuks elsewhere, the newly converted Mongol sultans in Iran and so on, they realized it was important for legitimacy to seek the blessing and backing of important Sufi sheikhs in their regions. So for any sultan reigning in Delhi, and Sheikh Nizamuddin had a very long life, he lived through several sultans. Ghiyasuddin Tughlaq was the last. Well, second last. It was important, right? Ghiyasuddin Tughlaq, what he really wants is a stamp of approval from Nizamuddin Auliya as the most revered and popular spiritual figure in his realm. He needs his stamp of approval. He needs his endorsement. But Nizamuddin was always unwilling to give it. As a matter of personal choice, he liked to stay away from the government and from matters of worldly power. Other Sufis did not, by the way, but this was something that Nizamuddin really believed in and stood up for. So there are other stories of how Ghiyasuddin Tughlaq would keep making appointments to come and visit Nizamuddin, etc. Mekalaram. He'd announce, send a royal decree. And somehow each time Nizamuddin would sort of give him the slip. Sometimes he, when he couldn't catch him, he would come on a surprise visit, and somehow because of his higher spiritual status, Nizamuddin would know what's happening, or wo पीछे के दरवाजे से निकल जाते थे जमात खाने के, and again Ghiyasuddin would be left hanging. And what are these stories for? What is their purpose? Why have they been preserved? It is to show how in the true nature of things, actually the resident Wali Allah, who was Nizamuddin, was a far more important and powerful figure than even the reigning sultan of the day. तो ये एक थी बहुत सख्त किस्म की rivalry कभी कभी होती थी, but mostly the sultans recognized that these guys wield a lot of influence, they are very important, and sometimes sultans were also genuine murids of certain sheikhs. And when that happened, then there was no rivalry, then there was a very close sort of symbiotic relationship between a sultan and a sheikh. And this became more and more common under the Mughals, where the Chishtis and the Mughals actually were very closely and intimately connected. So that is the later stage in the development of the Chishtiya order. This earlier stage, under the Delhi Sultans, there is a rivalry, and later on under the Mughals, there is a partnership. But both the rivalry and the partnership acknowledge the same thing. They acknowledge that just as the Sultan is the temporal ruler, right? The ruler of the material things in the kingdom of Hindustan, or, you know, Delhi and its surroundings. Parallel to him, there is a spiritual ruler who is the highest wali of the period and the place. बल्कि ये भी एक काफी highly developed concept है in several Sufi orders, the concept of vilayat, which comes from the word wali, and it is the concept of basically the spiritual kingdom, that the earth was carved up into regions that were under the spiritual care of the leading awliya of the time. So Punjab, Greater Punjab in the 13th century was believed to be under the vilayat of the Wali Baba Farid. Delhi and its environs were believed to be the vilayat of Nizamuddin, and so on. Now, why did the court qazis decide to pick on the subject of Sama? Yeah, it was a legal issue that was, you know, very common, and occasionally this question would come up in various parts of the Muslim world. But he picked it, obviously, because it was an issue where he felt that a debate that was conducted along legal lines would be much easier for him to win. And look at the way that he argues. I mean, just listen to this justification. Nizamuddin responds by quoting a hadith from the Prophet. So, ठीक है. अब hadith के बारे में, उसके content के बारे में, या उसके chain of isnad के बारे में, chain of transmission के बारे में, जो है कोई जवाब नहीं आता from Qazi Ruknuddin. He does what a lawyer would do, ना technicality निकालता है कि you are not an acknowledged legal mujtahid, and therefore you cannot quote directly from the hadith. It's a legal technicality and a very legalistic way of conducting an argument. What does the Sultan do at the end of all this? He refrains from passing judgment. Why? Because he cannot afford to take sides here. He cannot pick a fight with his own bureaucracy. And he absolutely does not wish to pick an open fight with Nizamuddin and his enormous popular support, as well as his support amongst the other Sufi sheikhs of the time, because together they were a formidable social force. They could lead a rebellion like this, which in later times they often did. And there is definitely an element of a more spiritual fear, right? A belief that the spirituality of these guys is for real, and that to really take on their enmity might be displeasing to God and might be harmful to the Sultan himself. There is definitely fear on that level as well. All right, a quick scroll through the chat. We have several comments on how both Hindus and Muslims were serviced and welcomed at Chishti Khanqahs, particularly under Nizamuddin, and that is a very important point. It is not true for all Sufi orders. The story of the Brahmin who had lost everything but still had his sacred thread and so was happy, and how this story is actually used to teach a lesson to a murid. By using the story of the Brahmin to teach a lesson to a Chishti murid, the implication is that it is possible for a Brahmin to get it right, to practice ihsan. He was very impressed with the Hindus worshipping, and he talked with Amir Khusro about how everybody had different faiths. I wouldn't say very impressed. I mean, he just noticed, and he had a moment of reflection where he said, "Har qaum apne tariqe se khuda ko dhoondti hai." It's in your slides. It's a famous exchange between Amir Khusro and Nizamuddin. The way he lived his life reminds us that worldly desires are futile. Yes. Okay. I think we have mostly covered it. I had noted these things down for you from somewhere else, so I'm just gonna walk you through them, and then we will get these notes. So a later 17th century Naqshbandi Sufi, and the Naqshbandis were far more Shari or legal-minded. He has this famous saying that if a prophet had ever been sent to this community, and the community of Muslims living in India, he would have practiced the Hanafi law. What is this? It's an endorsement of the Hanafi school of law as a mazhab. And then again, 17th century Chishti saint Abdul Rahman has a famous saying which says, the Sufi has no mazhab. Can somebody tell me what this means? The Sufi has no mazhab? जी हुज़ैफा।
मतलब मजहब वो वाला जो मतलब हनफी और मतलब
हाँ एग्जैक्टली, लेकिन हाँ आप और हम अगर ऐसे बगैर वो जाने इसको आज पढ़ लें, हम आउट ऑफ कॉन्टेक्स्ट इसको इंटरप्रेट करेंगे ना. इट विल साउंड टू अस एज उर्दू स्पीकर्स, मॉडर्न उर्दू स्पीकर्स, as saying the Sufi has no religion.
Yes.
Right? But what it means is something extremely different, that the Sufi is above the legal divisions of the legal schools. that he is a more universal type of Muslim or worshipper of God. All right. So, reminder, and I'll be posting it also, we have a really important guest lecture tomorrow evening with Dr. Gibran from the US. I'm really sorry I couldn't organize it during class hours, but I'd be very grateful to everybody who can attend so that we are able to have some live Q&A during the session. So please, if you can, be there. All right, take care. Khuda Hafiz.